Good evening. As far as I can remember, this is the very first class I have ever conducted, about which I can truthfully say I'm sorry to see it come to a close tonight. Never before, well, I know I've never said it, but never before have I felt it. Always before, Saturday night has been the most glorious night in the world for me. After Saturday night, I could dance in the street. And there is a reason, a very definite reason for this. I believe that for the first time in all of the classwork that's been going on since 1947, I believe that the principles of the infinite way have been understood by you. And I have never felt that way before. You see, the major principles of the infinite way, of course truth, is universal, and in mystical truth there is no such thing as an original idea. But in healing principles, the infinite way is an unfoldment of certain principles that have never before appeared in religious literature of any nature, whether it was mystical, orthodox, or metaphysical. And I have never been able to convey that before, because the students were either listening to me through their Christian Science background or their unity background or their mental science background, and not able to penetrate through to these specific principles. I know this, that if these principles had been understood by our students, we would have practitioners in every city where students have ever come from. And the only reason we haven't is because these specific principles have not been grasped, have not been understood, and therefore could not be demonstrated. Now, I don't say that in a complaining sense, because it is perfectly natural. Every one of us has, let's say has received teachings which we have more or less accepted as divine authority. And it makes no difference how mistaken those teachings may be, we find it impossible to dislodge them from our thought, from our being. In every message that embraces either mental or spiritual healing, the individual is dealt with. You either call the patient by their name, or you address them as you, or you seek to uncover the error in their thought, or you point out to them what they lack in qualities. You should be more loving or more grateful or more forgiving, so forth and so forth and so on. Always you. And even in silent and absent treatments, the patient is the one who is being treated. And that follows in every teaching except this one. And the only reason there is an infinite way, the only reason there's an infinite way book, the only reason there's an infinite way activity is that when these principles revealed themselves to me and I was able to do fine work with them, I wasn't able to convey it to those who were reading other literature because they missed the point. Then, after we started and students began coming to lectures and classes, they still read this literature one day and somebody else the next day, and next week somebody else, and probably 3 or 4 on the same day. And so it never became apparent to them that there were certain specific principles that had to be embodied or embraced in their consciousness and practiced. Now it appears, after these many years, that there are, first of all, more students who are confining themselves to the infinite way writings and beginning to perceive these specific principles. Also, there are more students actually practicing these principles in contemplative meditation and in treatments, and therefore, looking out from up here, the atmosphere is clearer. When I first started classwork, our classes lasted 2 weeks, and the reason was that the first 4 nights I made no progress. In front of me were Christian Scientists, Unity students, New Thought students, and I'm sure the Christian Scientists were all waiting for me to begin to hammer away at Mrs. Eddy or the Board of Directors or knock organization, and they had their mental walls up. I don't know what the Unity students or the New Thought ones expected, but I know that I would sit up here and just feel a mental wall out there, and I knew I wasn't getting through. Second night was slightly easier, but the third night there was a letdown and peace began. They began to have confidence that I wasn't sitting up here with snowballs or rocks in my pocket. And by the 4th night we got started into the classwork. But here, the atmosphere all of this week has been completely clear, as if you heard these principles and were responding to them, accepting them. And that's why I feel I could go on, and within another week or 2, we'd have this whole thing so clear that we'd probably have to publish a list of practitioners too. You see, in the history of the world, there have been some few hundred people who, by the grace of God, have received spiritual illumination to a sufficient extent to make it possible for us to consider them as mystics. And there have been a few thousand people, or maybe tens of thousands of people, who have, by grace of God, received a touch of the Spirit, and these, of course, represent the saddest element of society. You read about those in Dr. Buck's Cosmic Consciousness, the people who have had one touch of the Spirit and never could regain it again, didn't understand it when it came, didn't grasp the meaning of it or the significance of it, and never again could have the experience repeated. But all the rest of the world has had to go through life without illumination. Now, this isn't necessary, because with an understanding of the truth of being and a consistent living in that principle, the spiritual centers are opened. And it is possible for, if not everybody, at least everyone who earnestly turns to a spiritual teaching, to receive a tremendous measure of light. The degree of that, of course, varies with the individual and with the use they make of it after they receive it. Now, it is virtually impossible to receive spiritual light or illumination as long as your mind is divided against itself, a house divided against itself. And that means as long as you are entertaining the belief that God can do something to something or somebody, or that God can do something for somebody, as long as you entertain the belief in two powers, illumination is impossible, because that is the barrier that separates us from being that man who has his being in Christ. In other words, it is only in proportion as you come to the realization of the nature of God as omnipresence and infinity, and thereby are enabled to think of any and every form of discord as being not a condition and not a person, but a mental imposition, a malpractice, a temptation, state of hypnotism, a nothingness, in other words. Now, the barrier to that is that we think of each other as having certain qualities. Some are good, and some are bad. Some are spiritual, some are material. It is absolutely true that some of us are more materially minded than others. Some are more morally minded than others. Some are more sensually minded than others. Some are more money minded than others. But that is not true of the person. That is only true of what, out of the impersonal, they are manifesting. Now, to see a man actually in the act of stealing a wallet, you would have to be kind of foolish not to know that wrong is being done, that you are witnessing a form of error. But as long as you would call that man a thief, you cannot open your consciousness to spiritual illumination, because you can't be entertaining truth while having your mind filled with error. A truth and a lie cannot fill the same space at the same time. Therefore, if you do behold a man in the act of stealing a wallet, be sure that you have no thought about him whatsoever. But remember quickly, yes, this is it, the carnal mind in action. And thereby you have impersonalized it. You've taken it away from the person and placed it out here in space. And the moment you've done that, it dissolves. It has no more avenue of expression. It has no more person through whom to operate. Of course, the next step is, after impersonalization, nothingizing. That is, realizing that a carnal mind could not be constituted of God qualities, or otherwise it would be eternal and immortal and as good as God. Therefore, if it isn't created by God, it wasn't created, and so it can only exist as a state of illusion or a state of belief or a state of hypnotism. And you have completed your treatment. You may or you may not have healed that individual. His own receptivity may have something to do with whether or not that realization heals him. But you would have kept your own mind pure, full of truth, and therefore open to spiritual illumination, which could not have happened while you were holding a person in condemnation. Now, the whole basis of our healing work, and please remember that disease of every name in nature is handled in this way, so is every form of sin or false appetite. So is unemployment, and marital relations, and employer and employee relations, and capital and labor relations. Unless you are able to hold no one in judgment, you cannot bring about spiritual peace. Now, you might sit at a table and humanly, in one way or another, bring peace between capital and labor, between employer and employee, but you could not bring spiritual harmony into that scene, because in your mind you are accepting one side as right and one side as wrong. And in the whole of the spiritual kingdom, there is not a right side or a wrong side. There is only a spiritual side, which is in eternal harmony. When we'll just take it at its very lowest level. When we go into prison to do work of any nature at all, and we have no right to go in as infinite way students unless we have reached this understanding, we are not going in to reform anybody, nor are we going in to regenerate anybody, nor are we going in to teach anybody. It is the carnal mind, the world, that believes there are good and evil, that believes there is a man or a woman who has sinned or is sinning or will sin. It is this world that sits in judgment and says good or bad. Not the Christ. The Christ says, judge not after appearances, judge righteous judgment. It also says, why callest thou me good? There is but one good, the Father in heaven. And it also says, neither do I condemn thee. Therefore, you are not the Christ mind, while you have a right and a wrong, a good and a bad, a sick and a well. And the only way that you can come to that state of consciousness is by understanding first that God constitutes individual being. God has manifested itself as individual being. Every individual in the world is God in expression. The one mind and the one life and the one soul and the one spirit made individually manifest. God appearing as individual being. This is a universal truth. Has nothing to do with appearances. This is a universal spiritual truth. Then if this is the truth about you, and since God is no respecter of persons, this is the truth about everyone in jail and everyone in a hospital. Now, the healing Christ is the state of consciousness that first of all knows that truth. And then knows that because of this, no man is evil. No man is good. Every bit of good manifested by man is God in expression. But every bit of evil is the acceptance of two powers, the acceptance of good and evil, eating of that fruit of the tree of good and evil, and sick or well, sinful or pure, and judging by appearances. The Christ mind, then, separates evil from the individual and places it where it belongs, in the devil that is tempting us to accept these two powers, the devil which we now will call carnal mind or mortal mind. And having placed it there, we have taken the burden from your shoulders. You no longer have a guilt complex, no longer are sitting with a burden. If there is one individual anywhere who can look at you and look through the appearance and understand that anything you have done or are doing of an erroneous nature isn't you. It is merely your ignorance of the fact that you're being tempted by an impersonal source, and in your ignorance, acting upon it. You can't ever condemn a person for making a mistake. You can't ever condemn a person for doing something in ignorance. And therefore, every sin and every disease is the product of the ignorance of this very truth. God constitutes individual being, and any and every phase of discord is that carnal mind, that mortal mind. And so we've lifted the burden from you, from the man in prison, from the man in the hospital, from the man in the saloon, the man in the gambling house. We've lifted it from him, and we've placed it out here where it has no law, no activity, no cause, no person, and now it's dead. Now you can rest in that word. If you were sitting in an office or home and your telephone bell were ringing every minute and a half with another person calling for help, your entire treatment would take place between one call and the next call. And you could keep that up all day and all night. Because no matter what was said to you from out there, you would not be connecting it with a person, but with this impersonal carnal mind. And you would be nothingizing it even while they're talking. Then you'd hang up and rest in that word. Rest until the phone rang about 30 seconds later. And be assured of this. As you become clear on these points, that is what will happen to you. That is what happens to every individual who comes to the Christ state of consciousness. They draw unto themselves all those who want to be released. From what? Condemnation, ignorance, sin, fear, darkness. They are drawn to the light. You don't have to advertise. You don't have to let it be known what you know or what you're teaching. You don't have to wear a robe. Be as you are now and never speak about your religious convictions, and you will still be hunted down. You will still be chased up every alley until you shed the light and share it. And all there is to the Christ mind is the mind of an individual who does not have two powers, who does not sit in judgment or condemnation on any person or thing. It makes no difference what phase of life or facet of life it is. Political, commercial, top capitalist, evil labor union leaders. It makes no difference. They will exist as far as the human scene is concerned, and the sad part is they always will, until we learn to see that man couldn't be evil, man couldn't be selfish, unjust. It's an impossibility. For all there is to man is God made manifest. Ye are the temple of God. Ye are the temple of God. Your body is the temple of God. Your mind is the temple of God. Your being is the temple of God, because God constitutes your being. But we're talking now of every individual on the face of the globe, human, animal, vegetable, mineral. All is God in individual expression. This is the truth. Then, to every appearance, first of all, impersonalized. Don't ever tell anyone that they can be helped if they read 10 pages of a book, or go to church, or tithe, or are grateful, or are loving. It may all work beautifully on the psychological level if a human being could change their nature. Any psychologist or psychiatrist can tell you what you ought to be and how you will be if you attain it. Just the same as one of our comedians years ago used to tell us that he knew how to cure alcoholism. He had a sure cure for it that couldn't fail. All you have to do when you lift a glass of liquor is open your hand. Well, certainly, you know right well that's a sure cure. But come to the place where you, if you're alcoholic, can open that hand. And so it is, and I've heard this for so many years, oh, if you could just be more loving, if you could just be more forgiving, oh, if you didn't hate your mother-in-law so much, oh, if you were more generous, more grateful, oh, you've missed 3 Sundays in church. Yes, if you read so and so many pages. It's all nonsense, because psychologically it won't work, because no individual can change their nature. Only the activity of the Christ in their consciousness can change their nature. If they try to change it humanly, they are repressing. And when they repress, they explode someday. You can't repress. It's bound to break out. Therefore, to be different than we are, it becomes necessary that the Christ be introduced into our consciousness. And one way of doing that is to find the individual who is willing, not only willing, but able, to guide us through whatever experience it is, sin, disease, lack, or death, without criticism, without judgment, without condemnation, without trying to improve us, without moralizing, without preaching, but to be able to hold steadfast in the realization this has nothing to do with you. This is an activity of that carnal mind, that belief in good and evil. It's a hypnotic suggestion. It's just nothing but a mental imposition that has nothing to do with a person. And in the final analysis, it is the fleshly mind, or the arm of flesh, or nothingness, and does not have to be fought or overcome, just recognized for its nothingness, and then rest in that word. Here you have what is actually the secret of the healing work of the infinite way. This is how it is accomplished. It has nothing to do with prayers that try to influence God. It has nothing to do with finding somebody that is so holy that God is going to do something through them that God won't do through someone else. It has to do with specific principles. Now, I can tell you this. The very moment that you fully grasp the idea that all evil is impersonal, that very moment your consciousness is ready to be a transparency through which God appears. The Christ is made manifest. Your consciousness cannot be a transparency while it is double-minded, while it has good and evil in it. It cannot. Or let us say it this way, that since none of us can be wholly pure, that the Christ, we can be a transparency for the Christ in proportion as we are able to impersonalize all evil. Even though this truth was a part of my consciousness and I was doing healing work with it, I didn't consciously know it as a principle until I had been appointed first reader of Christian Science services in a prison. And my first Sunday in the desk was the most miserable experience I ever had. Science and Health, every time I tried to read from it, wanted to jump up and hit me in the face. And I finally had to do that with it. I'm sorry. But I did. I had to hold it firmly. I was so convinced that it was jumping up at me or trying to. And I had some help after it that didn't help. The second Sunday was just as bad, and so was the third. I tried to figure out what was wrong, and I couldn't. But the committee in charge of that activity had told me that all workers in the prison must protect themselves thoroughly from sin-filled thought. And so every Friday night I began to protect myself from sin-filled thought, and I kept at it steadily until Sunday morning. By that time it was ready to eat me up. It was my own evil mind coming back at me, what I was beholding outside. But after that third Sunday, came to the next Friday night, I sat down to my protective work, and then it dawned on me. Protect yourself from sin-filled thought, and man has no mind but God. Now, where would the sin-filled thought be? Man is pure, man is spiritual. And then this whole thing flooded me, that I was the fellow who was putting evil out there. And you can imagine what happened later when I learned that one of the men out there, at least, was completely innocent of any crime at all. I'd been railroaded by an attorney and a judge. And here I was protecting myself from his sin-filled thought. When I became reader there, the average attendance of science services was from 8 to 11 men every Sunday. A few months later, we had 77, and at the end of 18 months, we had 200 men in the prison attending science services. And there was only one reason. I spoke this over with our second reader, with our soloist and our pianist, our usher, and we went there every Sunday pure as pure. We went there completely in the realization that the only men we were meeting was God in expression, the Son of God, the temple of God, and that any appearance of evil was just hypnotic suggestion, was just the belief of good and evil. That's how I learned this principle consciously, through that experience. And it stood me in good stead when I began some prison work here in the island, and also saw miracles take place among those men. So much so that the assistant warden here has written me a letter stating that if only a few men in Honolulu would do for the men what I have done, they would have no prison problem. And I did nothing for them. They've never had money from me or food or anything of any nature. All they had was this, that ability to realize that regardless of the nature of their crime, it wasn't their fault and it wasn't them. In their ignorance, they accepted the temptation, they accepted the mental imposition of all the evil that's floating around in the air. But you see, we do the same thing with disease. We accept the temptation that's in the air. Somebody says there's an epidemic and we have to get sick. We've accepted the temptation. We've accepted the mental imposition, which we have the power to reject. The world doesn't, because it doesn't know the truth of impersonalization. That's why it has no defense against sin or disease, or lack or limitation. It has no defense. It is still being taught that if you just go to church regularly or tithe or pray upstairs, but you see, it all doesn't work. And they do not have this principle. Now, this is the principle through which we function. And this is the reason why our meditations can be successful. And it's also the reason why, when it's not successful, we can know that we're double-minded and we're sitting there in judgment, criticism, condemnation. In other words, we have not fulfilled the teaching of Jesus Christ, which says, when you go to the altar to pray, and there remember that any man has aught against thee, get up first, make thy peace with thy brother, and then return to the altar and offer thy gift. So it is. You can't go into meditation because you can't be at peace as long as you have not purified yourself. And don't forget that you can't purify yourself once and stay that way any more than you can take a bath once and stay clean. Purification is a continuous process. And I don't mean for a year or two, I mean forever as far as I'm concerned. It is a praying without ceasing, because the world mesmerism is terrific, and it will reach through into your consciousness unless you are alert and are able quickly, constantly to impersonalize. Once you can do that, you can meditate, because then your mind is not warring with anybody or anything. The mind will be still if there's no warfare, but there's always warfare if You have two powers. If you have good and evil, if you have desires, if you are still struggling to attain or achieve something, the mind can't be at rest. Now, there isn't any reason, really, to be struggling for anything, especially anything of a spiritual nature, because the struggle will prevent your attaining it. The struggle is mental, and as long as there's a mental activity, you won't have the spirit. It is only when you realize that I already am that the struggle is over. The struggle is all gone if I already am. There, you see, we come back to a mystical truth which is universal. Does not appear only in the infinite way. Actually, it appears in every mystical teaching that has ever been evolved. Every mystic has revealed that I am. I am. I think one of the stories, poems, that has always been very, very close to me is that of a woman mystic, a Muslim. But, and here again you see hypnotism is very strong, the Muslims are taught that if only they can get to Mecca, if only once in their lifetime, they'll be saved forever. Everything is wiped out. Their whole life is lived with God, if only they can get to Mecca just once. And so every year from every part of the Muslim world, there are pilgrimages to Mecca. And so this girl joined such a pilgrimage and had a difficult time of it. They crossed mountains and valleys and streams. They had hot weather and stormy weather and cold weather. They experienced all of the inconveniences of travel that existed a couple of 100 years ago. But eventually they all came to the outskirts of Mecca. Well, of course, everyone then broke into a run to get right into Mecca, and something halted this girl. She stopped and began to think, and finally she dropped to her knees. God, forgive me for coming all this way to find you in Mecca, you who had found me where I was. There was no need to travel. The Master said that centuries ago. No longer shall you worship in holy mountains, nor yet in Jerusalem in that holy temple. The kingdom of God is neither low here nor low there. It isn't any place. It's within you. And that realization brings you to the mystical truth. I am. Moses gave that to the world. I am that I am. And after that, he was no longer a shepherd. After that, he was a leader of men, a spiritual leader, only because of his realization, I am. I am that I am, and I am it now. Jesus repeated that. I am. I am that I am. I am that I am. I am the bread, and I am the wine, and I am the water. I am the life, and I am the resurrection. Not I'm searching, I'm seeking, I'm hoping, I'm praying. Now I've come to the realization I am. That realization that I am makes a shepherd a great leader. That recognition I am makes a Hebrew rabbi the light of the Christian world. It makes no difference what you are or where you are when the realization of I am comes to you. From that moment on, you aren't that person at all. You are the light of your particular world. It really makes no difference where you turn in the mystical writings. The Persian mystics, Muslim mystics, Hindu mystics, Chinese mystics, Japanese mystics, you'll find they all, and the Christian mystics, 12th to the 17th century, they will all give you the same message: I am. Now, in different degrees, that is the entire secret of mysticism, and when that realization is attained, it gives one freedom. And it's the only thing that does give one freedom, because in that I amness, there is no longer a desire for anything or anybody. There's no longer an ambition. There is no longer a strife or a struggle. There is a resting in that realization, and then through that realization, everything necessary for our fulfillment, whether it's person, place, thing, circumstance, or condition, automatically flows into existence. But you will find this, I know. You will more easily rise to the mystical experience after you have made a specific practice of impersonalizing and nothingizing. The very moment that you are not fighting powers apart from God, you are resting in I amness. 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. He had nothing left to fight for, because if the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Rest in that word. But you see that as long as there is opposition in your mind, as long as there is judgment in your mind, as long as there is duality, two powers, there is no way of your realizing I am. It is only when you have learned to impersonalize and nothingize that your consciousness is so clear, so transparent, that the Christ shines through, that spiritual light shines through. It is a presence that goes before you to make the crooked places straight. And that is one of the reasons that we can't heal everyone, and we can't heal everyone instantly. Because regardless of how true and pure our vision is, you can't remove the effect of something without removing the cause of it. And if an individual is rigidly maintaining within themselves these erroneous traits or whatever they may be, the condition of health or supply won't change until that state of consciousness has changed. Then when the state of consciousness changes, its externalization has to change because the cause isn't there. And what is the cause? Our ignorance, which makes us accept these two powers, which makes us personalize. In other words, then, most of us can be healed because we are not tenacious in our hates, envies, jealousies, or mad ambitions, regardless of the fact that humanly we all have traits and always have had. They are not violent, and they are not tenacious, and they are not what you might call deep or strong. Therefore, when we come into contact with a consciousness that is not holding us in condemnation, they change our consciousness very easily. When, however, you hit up against those who are adamant in their evils and want to cling to them, and have no desire to be free of them, then you have a more difficult time bringing the light to that consciousness. And for that reason, you will notice many times that you will have to stand very fast with a patient, sometimes for a long time, until there is a yielding within themselves. Because spiritual healing isn't merely adding health to the erroneous state of consciousness that we already are. Spiritual healing is bringing us to the position of yielding our material sense, our mortal sense, our two-ness, our duality. Therefore, some of the things in us are not readily healed. Very often, as students take up a study like this, they find conditions in their body changing and improving, and wonder why one thing or another thing persists while all these other things have cleared up. There's only one answer. They have not yet come to the complete surrender where they are willing to grant that God constitutes your being and you are wholly pure. And that means you and you and you and you. Because when they come to that point, then they find that discords rarely abide in them, except such as we bring upon ourselves by continuous violations of natural law. Well, there you are again, and it's time to rest again.